This video is brought to you by Wicket Cricket Manager.
Hello, I'm Jarrod Kimber. Welcome to another episode of Wagon Wheel, where I answer questions from everywhere, I suppose, all around the world, like a wagon wheel. That's kind of where I came up with the name. But also topics from everything as well. You can get your questions in early on Patreon, but of course, there are plenty of people in the comments already. I don't know how people get in the comments beforehand. Good on those people. But thanks to Max, Dex, Keshuv, and All Things Cinema Vodcast. I've never seen their podcast, but I'm sure it's spectacular by the amount of times they comment and their questions. That actually has some really good questions in here. But thank you to everyone in the comments on YouTube as well. If you have a super chat, I will get to it. I've got a lot of questions in the Patreon realm today, so I think I'm more likely to only get to super chats, but we'll see how we go towards the end. The only other thing I want you all know, hello to Ashish as well, who's just popped in, is that someone is cutting a willow tree right next to where I'm recording this. So if you do hear a chainsaw or a large crash, sorry for the chainsaw. If it's a large crash, I might have to stop and make sure that my house hasn't been destroyed. But that is what the noise is. Anyway, I have asked my neighbors whether I can get some of the wood and turned it into like a Homer Simpson Wonder Bat, but not at the moment. Renal is in the chat as well. All right, let's get to the Patreons. The Patriots. And we have Ian who says, how difficult do you find switching between more planned podcasts, Footmarks and Red Inker, and ones like Wagon Wheel, where the questions can be anything, or following on when you're reacting usually to that day's play? So following on, for those who haven't heard those are the ones I do over at TalkSport. I think this series I've been doing more of stuff with TalkSport on their main radio station, but I think they put that out on the following on feed as well. It's not particularly hard for me, Ian. I suppose, Footmarks, I've now got Bayram to basically, he reads my stuff and looks at the videos, and he's obviously involved in sort of the editorial side of things at times as well. So he can make a decision. I think he basically just goes off and comes with it. Sometimes he sends me the questions. Generally, I know the pieces. My biggest thing with that is I always wanted to do a podcast based on all the work I was doing, because it didn't make sense not to. But the actual time in the day for me to write the article and then go back or write the script and then go back and work it out was really, really tricky. So Bayram takes that off, but I know the pieces, and I always have extra stories that I haven't put in the video or in the article as well. So that's quite easy. Red Inker, I would say I probably do 30 to 40 minutes of preparation for a Red Inker, maybe slightly longer if it's a book where I want to cover a couple of chapters in. But again, all I'm really doing is reading and taking notes. And so I just have to make sure that the person keeps talking and that the conversation goes roughly in the right order. Wagon Wheel, I find really easy, which is weird because when I've done live events before, the questions never quite match up. But there's something about what we did on Polite Inquiries and now what we have here on Wagon Wheel, where the people understand the kind of questions I'm going to give better answers to. So in some ways, I suppose the audience is slightly trained, from that perspective. And that has worked out perfectly for us. It's why Polite Inquiries work so well. That was always my theory with Polite Inquiries. When I came up with that, was that me and George had a particular kind of fan base, follower base that understood what we were going for and what we were good at. And they did that. Whereas most people who tried to copy Polite Inquiries, of which there have been many, many unsuccessful versions of it, their bigger problem at that point was that they didn't have that sort of interaction with their follower base. And it's the same with Wagon Wheel. We all know that I've just said that I won't do any super chats. I won't do any questions today that aren't super chats. But of course, if I see a question inside that's interesting, I'm gonna mention it because I won't be able not to. So I find that pretty easy. Following on is the biggest problem with the following on in all those podcasts. And I see the Final Word guys do this, and I'm trying to think of some of the others. I think Daniel Norcross does Zero Ducks Given at the end of the day as well. I just think it's a really exhausting time to do a podcast. I find it much easier, to write my articles and, sort of speak out something that I've been thinking about for 3 or 4 hours. Whereas you get to the end of the day and there's this sort of collapse of your energy. Some of these test days, especially if you're a broadcaster or, you have to do crosses in the morning or whatever, you're talking about 12, 14 hours sometimes. And then you got to do a podcast at the end. that's where I have the most problem with the Following On podcast. But I also know on that one that I've got two co-hosts, right? So I'm the guest, and I've got John Norman who's going to ask me one kind of question, and Steve Harmison's going to ask me another one. They're both probably going to be fairly interesting things. I'm probably going to want to talk about them. They both know me very well. So you get to a rhythm with all these sorts of shows. Wagon Wheel, when I first started, I felt a little, what's the best way of putting it? I think I was a little bit more worried about what the questions were going to be. And then after a while, I realized that actually the majority of these questions I'll be able to answer. But it's a weird, it's such a, I want to be able to do podcasts 7 days a week, but what I don't want to be doing is a podcast every day. And so we're trying to come up with shows. We've got another show with another guest starting shortly, which is very different to everything else we do. The idea is to come up with as much interesting content where we could just talk about cricket every day. I don't care if all the shows are very different, as long as I can record some of them in batches, or like with Wagon Wheel or Uncovered, we can sort of fit it around, my schedule or Barrett's schedule or Bayram's schedule and all these sorts of things. That's kind of the most important things with all these shows. GD25 says, what could a team like India do to force a result when they know rain is forecast on days 4 and 5? Other than Jadeja, the 4 batters across 50 did so better than their career strike rates. Is it a case of selecting an attacking batter in place of an anchor, or maybe promoting someone like Ishan like they did in the second innings? It's painful to see the valuable World Test Championship points lost to a day and a half of rain. Rain is, there's no great answer to this, GD, and I'll tell you why. Quite a few years ago, I'm trying to remember what it was now, but I know it was Graham Swan. So I want to say it was around 2011 or 2012. Well, Graham Swan said that the England team didn't plan for rain. And I've talked to Swanee since then, and I'm pretty sure he now doesn't agree with that and has gone back on it. And now he thinks that teams should plan for rain. But I think at a certain point that we almost never have the amount of rain that is scheduled, or we have twice as much rain, or we have rain on days when there wasn't any scheduled anyway. The point is that weather changes, and we are very accurate at predicting weather changes now compared to what we were 30 or 40 years ago, but we still can't actually work this out. And so if you're completely changing your team for that, you have to be almost positive. And I don't know how anyone would be positive on the morning of a game that day 3 or day 4 and day 5 are going to have heavy rain. I just don't see how you could ever be that way. It is a little bit different, perhaps, if the rain was scheduled for day 1 and day 2. Day 1, you're already on day 1, so you can make your decisions there. And day 2, of course, is not quite as far away. So I think that's the most important thing to know, right? And the amount of times I've turned up to test matches where people have said there's going to be just absolutely torrential rain, and there's no rain. In fact, the best one I remember, there was a storm when we were in South Africa. So it was at PE. So I've forgotten the new name of PE, but there was a storm that was supposed to be coming up that meant that there would be no play on the 5th day. And it's all anyone could talk about. All the maps and all these different things talked about how there was going to be a huge storm. And both teams played it like the 4th day was the last day. And I wonder now if Australia had played it like there was another day coming up, if they would have batted slightly differently. And because of that, it maybe allowed, maybe gave them more panic than they needed to have. And it turned out next day that there would have been quite a few hours of play. It was dark the next day, and there was a little bit of rain, but they certainly would have been hours and hours of play before the rain sort of came in. And so you can get yourself in a muddle by thinking about the rain and by not thinking about the rain. The only thing I would say about India's first innings is, I know you said their strike rates were quite high, but they scored at 3.5 runs and over in that first innings. And I think once they got a lead, even if they got 150 runs in front as quickly as possible, then they would have put themselves in a much better situation. But it's hard enough predicting pitches and players and form and drop catches and everything else. You throw weather in, good luck. Ben says, how important is elite mateship in building a successful team? To what degree can great players afford to be bad blokes? Should a good bloke ever be picked over a KP type player? So I always go back to the All Blacks. So the All Blacks have, I think it's called the no dickhead rule. Is it the All Blacks who have the no dickhead rule? I think it's that. Let's see. See if I've got that right. No dickheads. Yeah, I think that's the one. And I know so many people in sport and in business who have kind of taken this on board of it's better not to have those sorts of disruptive people around. I don't think anyone ever factors in that New Zealand has so much more talent than anyone else, right? You can't do that if you're the New Zealand cricket team. You can't, not pick your 3 best players because they're a bit, weird. Under that, Glenn Turner, Richard Hadley, Martin Crowe, Baz McCullum at times. Who else have they had? Trying to think of any other sort of famous dickheads. Not that those guys were always dickheads or whatever, but they were prickly and they had their own theory. What? So you don't pick Hadley because he doesn't get along with all the other guys? Like, it's nonsense. And I think there is a real difference between. Oh, what's the best way of putting it? There's a real difference between that and an office or non-high performance jobs. There are very few things in the world where you end up at a, whether you're coders or lawyers or gardeners, just saying that because of the guys out of the window who are currently gardening, where you're going to have the ability to pick the best people in the world, and it's going to make a huge amount of difference, and you can afford them and everything else. But pro sport is obviously one of those. And so if you're in that situation where you're not picking the best players, you're going to hope that your replacement is close enough to them to be able to help. I think you could make, there are several people who absolutely love Shane Warne. But obviously there was the Shane Warne-Gilchrist relationship. You could make a perfect argument that Shane Warne would not be a good bloke at all times. Shane Warne did what Shane Warne wanted. Viv Richards did what Viv Richards wanted, right? Sachin, to a certain point, did what Sachin wanted. And so I do think when you get to that sort of level, that is kind of what you are paying for. And so are we saying that a first-class cricketer who's slightly above average, who could probably be a sub-test player, who's a great bloke, who's going to do all the throwdowns for all the other guys, he's going to give everyone coaching tips, he's going to make the change room feel better. Is he going to change things more than KP? Well, clearly not, right? He clearly isn't. The other thing is that these are work relationships. And I think because we know, because we have this personal investment in these relationships, I do think at times that people get a little bit over the top. But I've never worked with 15 people in my life where I liked all 15 of those people. I don't think it's even physically possible unless you're just the sort of person who likes everyone, right? And sometimes you're going to be the dick in certain situations. And sometimes the other person's going to be the dick in certain situations. And, to go back to, the Stanford prison experiment, you give people certain roles and they become other kinds of people as well. And so within that, there is no way of doing that. I think in Test cricket, what I would be doing is, it really is about ego management. It is about personal behavior management, how you get the best out of all the players as a group and all those sorts of things. But if you don't pick your best 3 players because they're difficult, then you're probably either going to really struggle, or you'll have the other situation is where you're the All Blacks and it won't matter. GD, again, where have you seen the best fan? I think he means fan facilities here. Stinky stadiums, dirty facilities, bad food, irate, lathy-wielding cops at most Indian venues make it a challenge to enjoy cricket. But anecdotal evidence from friends suggests that rude, boorish, drunk fans at England venues and racist security staff at Australian venues spoils it for others too. I haven't heard anything about racist security staff at Australian venues, although I think I've said this before. I was choked by a woman at the Gabba. No, it's not the Gabba, the Wacker. Australian of the cricket grounds in the world, the Australians have the best facilities, partly because Australia has more room than other places, but also, Aussie rules football in some cases have helped pay for these things. But there's, it's very obvious when you go to the English grounds that quite often there just isn't the facilities around the grounds to actually help the fans the way they should be. Talking about family stuff, kids, women's toilets, all the sorts of basic things that should be there. England grounds don't have. Indian grounds are far worse. The amount of money in Indian sport, they should have the best stadiums in the world. Wankhede and Pune are like good stadiums, but I don't think either of them would stand out compared to, some of the stadiums in Australia. The England stadiums, as I said, are a bit antique. You certainly do get drunk fans in England, Australia. South Africa, and a little bit in New Zealand, although not as bad in New Zealand. But, you certainly get that in those venues in a way that you obviously don't throughout the majority of Asia, where you can't drink. The West Indian fans are probably the loudest, but there's not as many of them anymore. So, they're the most likely to say something abusive to players or maybe not other fans, but, get under your skin. That is certainly some of the venues, but there just aren't many of them. So, the old days of the rec ground are sort of finished, and Sabina Park isn't the Sabina Park of, the 70s, 80s, and 90s anymore. But there's a lot of cricket grounds around the world. South Africa is one that comes to mind, where the facilities just aren't great. A lot of outside of probably Australia and England, and I haven't been to enough of the sort of the outside bits of New Zealand grounds, so I don't know where they would go on this. But outside of Australia and England, I wouldn't say that the toilet facilities are particularly good in a lot of those places. The food's got a lot better at cricket grounds than when I first started. It's finally sort of catching up with how other sports feed their fans. But toilets, extra facilities, and everything else, I think cricket's still a long way behind sort of the best of the sort of top end European football clubs and the American facilities. You go over to a place like the Coliseum, which is a bit of a dump, where Oakland A's play, and it's still probably towers over most cricket grounds, I would say, from that perspective. I don't think in general cricket fans are particularly well looked after. Sandip says, how do you see Moeen's place in England 11 going forward? Surely he must play in India. You would think so, Sandip. Look, I suppose I have to have a big conversation with him coming to the end of this Ashes. I think we talked about this. Well, I mean, we as a cricket fan group talked about this a little bit when baseball started to become a thing, and I think they reached out to him at the time to see how he was feeling. And fair to say that at that point, I don't think Moeen thought anything was changing enough to bring him back. Maybe a year of watching on the sidelines, he's like, oh, this is legit. I am willing to come back in. I wouldn't have thought he's going to commit himself to a long period. But he might say, and a lot of this might depend on, how the IPL goes and what sort of deals he gets outside of the IPL and everything else. But I would have thought that there's no reason why he can't come back in, but he probably won't play county cricket consistently. And he probably won't put a lot of time in. So England are going to have to make a choice on that. But he's still a very, very talented player. He's a weird player. I just did obviously a whole video on him. There's a podcast with Bayram as well. He's a really fascinating player because he doesn't quite fit in. He's not a batter. He's not a frontline bowler. But he has both of those skills available to him when he needs them. Even if you say he's a bits and pieces player, he's bits and pieces players don't take 200 test wickets. So he's just so weird, but he gives England so many options because of all the different things he can do. Well, that's also part of the reason why they haven't got the most out of it. Patrick says, how much of England's performance at Old Trafford do you think they can build on, and how much was it just a good day? I think Australia helped them on the first day by having a bad day. I think it was Marnus afterwards who said they gave away, so many good starts in that innings. And so from that perspective, if Australia makes 450, which they should have made on that wicket, and with the starts that they all got, it's a very, very different test match from that point forward, right? But I also think that England have got very good at finding ways to chip wickets out of Australia specifically, but all their teams have been playing over the last year and a bit. Other than a few key partnerships, Mitchell and Bundle, and Williamson at times, and these sorts of things, England's been pretty consistent at chipping teams out. There's a lot to like out of baseball. I saw the Harry Brook comment, before I came on, about them wanting to play entertaining cricket more than winning test matches. They've been bowling at 9.5 overs of short balls with 78 miles an hour. What the fuck are they even talking about sometimes with this? Focus on the cricket bits. I would love to have just come out and go, do you know what? We feel we're the better team, and we're now not in a position to be able to win this series. So does that mean we were wrong? Or does that mean that we can actually get better and there are things to take out of these losses? And it feels like they're in the other way. They're looking at this from, no, we did everything right and things just went against us. That would be, whether it's Old Trafford or anything, Patrick, that's the real key for me. Which way are they looking at this? Because if they're looking at it from the way that I would look at it, which is there's a lot going right here. I still think Australia's a better team, and I think England have, well, now probably quite handily outplayed them throughout the series. That's an incredible sign, even if they're doing it at home. But if they're not looking at everything they're doing and judging themselves and trying to get better and using all their different new tricks in the best possible way, what are we even doing here? Entertaining the crowd with fucking Ollie Robinson bounces. Go fuck yourself. Ian says, I know they won at Lords after he limped off, but has Nathan Lyon's absence been a bigger loss in the series than Leach and Archer combined? Oh, Leach and Archer combined is interesting. I think that England has not always had Leach playing for them, and they have not always had Archer playing for them. And so that it is easier to cover those things than it is to cover Lyon, because Lyon is just always there. The consistent players who perform over and over and over again and never get injured are the hardest to replace. Just because how can their understudies be ready, right? How can the team understand? Like, even if Todd Murphy had bowled better at Leeds, and I thought he bowled okay at times, and I think he struggled at other times there. But even if he bowled better there, he wouldn't be able to bowl in the same way as Nathan Lyon. Eventually, he would find his own way, and he would go about it, and the team would meld to him. But Nathan Lyon has, to quote Liam Neeson, a very particular set of skills, right? That the ability to take wickets in the first innings as a spinner is very different than other bowlers, than other spinners, I should say. And so because of that, I do think that it means he's very hard to replace from that point of view. Still think Tom Murphy's a very good like for him. And maybe if he played over the entire series. Having said all that, I mean, both teams are losing players. You could also, I know this is a weird one, but, Jai Richardson would probably be a very handy player to come in for Australia as well. And even if he was fit, and on a day-to-day basis, I don't know where Jai Richardson's fitness is, but even if he was fit, he's not as experienced as he should be to be thrown into this situation because of all the injuries he's had so far. Jai Richardson is a different bowler to Mark Wood, but Jai Richardson is sort of a Mark Wood-esque in we've seen enough snippets to know that it's probably the real thing. But are we ever going to see it consistently over any period? And will he have maybe moments like Mark Wood where he comes in? I don't know, but it's very interesting. Abby says, you've probably been asked this a million times, but can you put together a 4+1 all-rounder bowling attack from the set currently active players that, in your opinion, would have been the best chance of taking 20 wickets in all conditions? I don't know if I have been asked that. In all conditions, so you would take Pat Cummins and Jadeja, and then you would take Ashwin. Would you take Bumrah? You want all conditions. Do you want Rabada? Jamison? Shahid? Yeah, so there's quite a few out there. Am I missing anyone else? Obviously, Jimmy a couple of years ago, but probably not quite at the moment. So if you take Jamison, he swings it. Pat Cummins and Bumrah will bowl their stuff. So you've got the swing covered. You've got the height covered there. You've got the pace covered. And then you've got the two guys who spin it in either direction. And in Jamison, Cummins, and Ashwin, you then have extra batting in all of that. And I can't think of a situation where... Yeah, I can't think of a situation where that is not going to take wickets. I'm trying to think of all the different pitch combinations in the world. I mean, you could swap Rabada in for Jamison, especially because he's got much more experience at that point, and I've got no problem. Peak Nokia, I probably would have had in there, but I'm not sure how his body is actually holding up at the moment. Yeah, but I think Jamison, just because he could swing it, is a bit different than the other two. Is probably you've got all those different. I mean, you wouldn't want to face that attack, would you? Prashant says, will the next generation of test batters put a lesser premium on their wicket and a higher weightage on strike rates? If so, will average remain the right metric to measure the performance of batters, or do we need to start thinking about newer metrics as we've done with the white ball game? We've already got many other metrics, within Test cricket. We now look at, average compared to era, average compared to match situation, average compared to position in the game, strike rate. I've said this before, Prashant, but unless you're scoring at over 70 in your strike rate, I'm not sure how much impact that you're actually making. There's a lot of players who have a strike rate from 45 to 55 and 60 that you would not, some you would think of as aggressive and unaggressive, and some you would think of attacking and, some you think of as the opposite of whatever I just said. And so I do think from that perspective, you can't be, there isn't that much of a difference. Once you get over 70, especially 75 and 80, that sort of Quinton de Kock, Avrinder Sehwag, Adam Gilchrist kind of mark, peak David Warner mark. Trumper might be up there as well. Those sorts of guys. Viv, I think Viv's around 70, 75 as well. Once you get up around there, the speed at which those guys score is very, very off-putting to teams. And so it makes a big impact. But if they're not averaging 45 while doing it, if Quinton de Kock isn't averaging 35 or 40, he's averaging 27. Does it matter that he's scoring at a strike rate of 80? I don't think it does, because over 5 days, the amount of runs that you make is still going to be more important than the speed that you got them. That's not always the case in individual innings, and it's not always the case on how you can put pressure back onto the opposition. Zach Crawley and Ben Duckett both being able to score at strike rates of 70 to 100 quite regularly is an ability to put a lot of pressure back on the opposition very, very quickly. So from that point of view, their speed matters more than it does to some other players. But if they both average 27 in their career, then it might help the middle order, but they're still not making enough runs to make a big enough impact overall on winning the game, right? And so the difference is most of the players with very, very good strike rates also end up averaging very high. And so that is still the impact. So the average will never go away from that point of view. Anyway, let us just take a break. And then after the break, we'll get back with more questions from the room. You're listening to Uncovered with Jarrod. It's Wagon Wheel, isn't it? I read the wrong ad then. You're listening to Wagon Wheel with Jarrod Kimber. Googlies, quarter seamer, carom, dukes, back of the hand, red, leg cutters, teesra, pink, knuckle, white, slider, seed, heavy, bounces, cherry, length, pill, off cutters, old, crimson traveller, kookaburra, hard, outswing, second new, off spin, arm, SG, split finger, shiny, leg spin, soft, new, yorkers, flippers, wrong-uns, long hops, reverse swing, half volley, and third new. These are just some of the names we use for balls in cricket. Well, Manscaped wants you to be as proud of your balls as you are of the ones delivered by your favourite cricketer. Manscaped just launched their 4th generation trimmer, the Lawnmower 4.0. Join over 2 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped with this exclusive offer, 20% off and free worldwide shipping. Insert the code REDINKA at manscaped.com. I've actually used this, not just something that I'm hawking for fun, and I got to admit, I thought it was a bit silly, and then I went down there and it was exceptional. I honestly feel I could bowl outswing with one nut and inswing with the other. So get 20% off and free worldwide shipping with the code REDINKA at manscaped.com. Manscaped, for the man who cares about his balls as much as the ones out in the middle. Thank you to everyone in the chat who've got in here. Samir, Connor, Waleed, AAM, Our Earth is the Best, Kushwant, Sahil. So thank you to everyone who's in the chat at the moment. But let us get back to the questions. Aditya says, do you have any theories on why 3 generations of Queensland wicketkeepers have been seen as third line? Second, Hartley, and now Pearson. WA had Campbell, Ronke, and Inglis at international contention after Gilchrist. New South Wales had Haddon and Neville. SA had Manu and now has Kerry. And Queensland ones always seem close, but not close enough. I think that none of them are. I mean, I'd have to have a look. Seckham and Hartley, off the top of my head, I would absolutely say that their batting wasn't at the level that was needed by the time they came through. So by the time Seckham sort of comes through, I think the idea of what batting is for a wicketkeeper has changed. And I think that Hartley, I'd have to go back and have a look at it, but my memory of Hartley was that he didn't have a particularly high batting average either. So at that stage, we in cricket had moved to batter keepers, and those are keeper batters. Jimmy Peirson, I think with Jimmy Peirson that, and I'd have to go back and have a look at his full record because he averages 35 in first class record. But my memory is that when Carey was coming through, that Carey had those couple of big years in the Big Bash, which kind of changed everything for him. And I think because of that, there was a real movement towards him. They thought he was the right kind of player and everything else. Peirson was probably wrong place at wrong time. But I've seen enough of Peirson to know that while he can bat, he's probably not as dynamic as, Inglis and Carey and some of the other players. So again, his batting is probably better. He's probably held back a little bit by, I've just got his white ball stats up here. He's held back a little bit by his list A average is 28 with a strike rate of 86. So if you're comparing him to Alex Carey, let's just bring up Carey's numbers as well. Alex Carey averages about the same in first class cricket, but his list A record is 36, right? And a lot of that is, a one-day internationals where he's been averaging 35. So from that perspective, I think he's just, again, another tier up. So if you want to ask, and this is just off the top of my head, Aditya, but if you want to ask, the real reason is, I think if you look at this, that wicket keeping in Queensland is probably they still look maybe slightly more for a specialist than some other teams do. For instance, they had Ben Dunk up there, right? And weren't as warm on him as everyone else. Whereas other teams were happy to let Ben Dunk take the gloves, despite the fact that Ben Dunk's not a particularly good wicketkeeper. So I think that does tell you that there's a slightly different model in Queensland when it comes to keepers and batters than there is everywhere else. James says, following on from Prashant's question about average and strike rate, do you have a favorite metrics for players' contribution to the likelihood of their team winning? What do you think of Cricinfo's T20 Super Stats, which seems to be an attempt at this? And have you seen the concept applied well to ODI and Test cricket? So Super Stats, I think, I'm trying to think back if I was involved in maybe some of the original conversations around Super Stats, very, very lightly. The other guys obviously did the majority of the work, but I think I was very lightly involved. But I do remember trying to guide them towards things. I think for me, I become less and less interested with impact metrics and VORPs and value over replacement and all these different things when it comes to players. I know myself and Jonas, we used to get into the runs above average metric and all that sort of stuff, but it was quite clear after a while that runs above average metric really favored opening batters. And I think most of these, because cricket has so many different roles within every team, and everyone's doing something different at a different time, you have to be very careful. So what I'm more interested now in is, so looking at the great all-rounders, but then looking at the usage, looking at, okay, so they were really good in this team, but did they actually change the way that their team shaped, right? Those sorts of things for all-rounders. For if I'm looking at an opening bowler, I want, in T20 cricket, I want to specifically know how many wickets they're getting more than average than anyone else, because that's the most important thing for me at that point of the game. So I'm probably how that might affect their overall numbers, I'm less interested in, but that's the sort of thing that I'm looking at. And I think that when you come to Test cricket, I'm looking more at those sorts of things as well. I haven't done as much advanced stats with Test cricket. We will be doing them fairly soon. I got myself a team, and we're going through them as it is. And we're trying to find the 50 best batters of all time, but we're also using that as a metric to work these things out. So I think I might have said this before, but the average compared to your era, the average of your batting position, the average of the other, the pitch in the match that you were playing, your home versus away average, your average, little things like I want to know a team's average in Asia, and also want to know a team's average a player's average in Asia, but also want to know a player's average in England, South Africa, and New Zealand, so that we have a good idea of when the ball's swinging and seaming, and we have a good idea when the ball is spinning, right? These little things to go back all the way through, cricket, so we get a better idea of how these things sort of work out historically. And then, now we have the context of when these players are good against these different things. So, I can't remember the last time I had a look at Cricinfo Super Stats, but I certainly used to use, they had a team make up this incredible stats template, which never went public for some reason, which I thought was incredible. And I used that for ages. There's some great stuff in there. But essentially, the more information that we can have, the more people can come up with good metrics. And so I just wish more of it was available and out there for people. Nadika says, is there an argument that the great wicket keepers of the past, Bob Taylor, are slightly overrated because the spin and medium pace bowlers they stood up to at the stumps were bowling at slower speeds than comparable bowlers today? No, because those wicket keepers were specialist wicket keepers. They spent all their time working on wicket keeping. Someone like Bob Taylor, was very uninterested in his batting, right? Darren Berry never really improved all that much as a batter because he spent so much time as wicket keeping, and modern wicket keepers just don't spend that much time. And if you look at the technical aspects, even if the bowling is slower, look at the footwork of old wicket keepers compared to today. There's no doubt that wicket keeping has changed as an art form, and it's improved in some ways as well. The athleticism is certainly a lot better than it's ever been before. You've also got the feet and the way that people move around. Not the feet. Things like Dhoni's hands, taking the ball in front of the stumps when the throw is coming in, and everything else. Look, someone like Bob Taylor or Jack Russell could certainly keep up with the stumps a lot easier than wicket keepers now could, just because of the pace. And we're still seeing some, Bairstow coming up to the stumps and Carey coming up to the stumps at times. In this Ashes, we saw Blundell do it in New Zealand. We're going to see that more and more in cricket at the moment, and teams are going to take that chance. Because I think traditionally there was this thought that it would cost them and they would be punished for it. It's actually that wicket keepers don't miss that many. It's the catching, which is obviously the biggest issue for a standard edge. And I think the technician, if to go back to my favorite cricketer of all time, Nadika, which is Seymour Clarke, who played in 5 first-class games and never made a run and was an incredible wicketkeeper. Could you imagine that player coming anymore? So, no. And if you look at, there's a really good catch that Alan Knott took, where the footwork and everything is just great. You watch James Foster up at the stumps to Graham Napier. You watch Darren Berry up at the stumps to Paul Rifle. The leg side stumpings that are just absolutely incredible, that we don't see as much in international cricket anymore, because the skills that you need just aren't there. So, for instance, I floated out that Ireland should probably, try and have their keepers up at the stumps for all their bowlers to keep the Irish players in their crease. And the Irish, Lorcan Tucker just couldn't do that. That's just not a skill set that he has. Bob Taylor would have been able to do it to that speed of bowlers, right? Darren Berry would have done it to that speed of bowlers. James Foster would have done it. Prasanna Jayawardene would have done it. There's lots of wicket keepers through history, but these are guys who got good at wicket keeping, and that is why they were paid as professionals. Almost no one does that anymore. There is an argument for Bob Taylor, and you can put Sarah Taylor, you can put all the Taylors in this, that when the ball does come a little bit slower, I think we probably overvalue women's wicket keeping at times because of this, right? It is easier to stand up at the stumps in women's cricket because the bowlers are a lot slower. If you're up at the stumps to I don't know, peak Elise Perry. I'm trying to think of some of the fastest bowlers, Shabam Ismail, those sorts of bowlers, right? In men's cricket, you probably would have, you could have, if you wanted to anyway, a wicket keeper come up to the stumps to them bowling at their top pace. We haven't seen the women do that. So there are probably times we do that. But if you go back and you have a look at clips of Bob Taylor wicket keeping, you will see a different kind of wicket keeping than we see today. And it isn't just a lack of pace. It is literally that those wicket keepers are almost always in the right position. They weren't caught out very, very often. And the modern wicket keepers are a lot more like fielders in that they are reacting when something happens. And because they're such incredible athletes, some of them can overcome that. But as I've said before, if you're diving all the time, you're going to drop more catches than a wicketkeeper who's just using their feet. And the extra pace on the ball actually allows you to be further back as well. and have the ball carry further, you don't have to be as stationary as modern wicket keepers are. HW341 says, why is it the domestic first-class cricket never took off in popularity compared to the international game, as it did in other sports like soccer and rugby? Well, actually, it did. It was a fantastic. County cricket was bigger than international cricket essentially until World War II. Doesn't mean that international cricket didn't get great crowds and everything else, but it was absolutely huge. If you go back and have a look at the Shield cricket, there are Shield games with 50 and 60,000 people at the MCG, Victoria, New South Wales. In Sri Lanka, they used to play the first-class games out on the radio. Live scores of them coming through. There are different parts where it didn't take off as much. And in some of those parts, I think what happened was international cricket kind of beat it to its popularity. But the fact that county cricket still exists today tells you that it didn't exactly die off. What happens is, I think, once international cricket comes along, so if you compare it, what have you compared it to? Soccer and rugby. If you could have 5 test matches throughout a summer and you're only going to go to a handful of games in a summer, I think that there's a fair chance that you're going to be going, you're going to go to your international when it's in your area. So if you're in, let's just say England, because that's where first-class cricket is most popular, you're going to go to that local game. So if you're up north, Manchester, Leeds, Durham, when they had test matches, those sorts of things, you will go to. In the south, you might go to one of the London tests or the one in Hampshire, the Ashes in Hampshire. Anyway, so from that perspective, I think that is a bigger kind of event, right? So even if you are going to lots of county games occasionally, they're happening all the time. They're quite often during, and this is a huge part. This is why it's very different than soccer or rugby. The majority of county cricket is being played during a weekday, during the daytime. Also, a lot of cricket fans play cricket. So if you do play cricket and you play on Saturday or Sunday, you're losing another day to be able to go there. You might take that off to go to a boutique international or, a one-off international game in your local area. But in county cricket, you're probably not going to take that off. But I do think that just overall that once international cricket becomes so big, I think that especially after World War II, and that's when the Shield crowds start dropping off. And it's certainly when county cricket becomes, if not less important, but less the thing that is talked about as much, right? International cricket starts to creep up in England. I think the international game, because of the amount of cricket that can be played, because of the way that it is played, becomes the best format. So what you're talking about is the second best format. I'm not sure that is the case in rugby or soccer, right? You can make very good arguments that outside of, if you're in a place with a major soccer league, Germany or Spain or England, that you have some of the best players in the world coming to play for you, right? That is not quite the case in cricket. And, the amount of times that you hear these great stories of facing a guy at one end bowling 72-mile-an-hour wobblers, and at the other end, it's, Sylvester Clarke, or name your West Indian fast bowler. It's not quite the same as, perhaps what football and rugby was doing when they went out and their club games became very big. But they're all 3 of those sports, despite them all being England, developed very differently to each other. So it's very hard to compare any of them to each other. Aditya says, what role, if any, do bloggers have in today's cricket media? It looks to me like they've either shifted to traditional media or social media. Yeah, so I think in 2010, 2011, so I started blogging in 2007. So by 2010, 2011, this isn't a cricket thing, Aditya. Essentially what happens is that the media has changed. And so people like me started getting sucked into the mainstream media. And up until that point, you could actually make a bit of money by doing a blog if you had a few fans. But more importantly, there was a community of bloggers. And so because of that, there were so many out there that if you had a good blog, you would get a bump because there were 5 or 6 other blogs that would probably mention you. And it all sort of went up together. But that's how blogging was in general. Chef blogs and music blogs and all these different things were like that. What happened is that sort of the biggest of us get sucked into the mainstream media, and we started becoming bloggers for them. And, we are getting paid for them. And then that same period, that 2010, 2011, Twitter comes along. And Twitter is a microblogging platform, right? Maybe even more so now than it ever has been before. And I think the combination of those two things just sort of sucked the heart out of it. So now you have a few people with emailers. Obviously, CS, Chiwanza has an emailer. Manthorpe has an emailer. Katakea has an emailer. I'm trying to think who else in cricket. Well, the Caribbean cricket guys, they have an emailer. But there's quite a few. Dan Weston has an emailer. So this is probably the strongest the emailer is basically a blog, right? Just that it's a blog and you can send it into people's boxes. So I think this is probably the first time since that big blogging movement that people have gone back to writing for themselves, because there's a way of making money from it. And when there was a way of making money from it with blogging, people went there. But once that whole sort of world died, Blogspot and WordPress are no longer as important, and Medium never quite took over. From what I could tell, there wasn't really anywhere to go. So you're better off trying to get your article on, I don't know, First Post or on page 2 of Cricinfo, or what other random sites were. What was the one in South Africa? I always forget the name of. But there were random ones around. You're better off to get $25 or $50 for writing there than you were for your own blog at that point. And so now you're in a situation where I suppose the people who would be bloggers today are either on social media, or they've got podcasts, or they've got YouTube. So it's all the same. You just find new mediums, because that's the way that people look at information, look for their stuff. James says, how would you rate the success of the international under-19 concept in terms of producing senior international players, or indeed in any other metric? So, James, I've just done a podcast with Kylie McDaniel, a baseball scout, and it's worth just having a look at how much information they have about young baseballers compared to what we have about cricketers. It's pathetic, really, how little we know about prospects in cricket coming through. And so under 19 cricket, I find it hard to take it seriously. They don't play that many games. I would take it a lot more seriously if we could see these players at under 17, under 19, and under 21. I'd take it a lot more seriously if they were really long tournaments, so we could actually start to gauge how good talent was. I actually think that there's a lot of money coming into cricket at the moment. I'd be really interested to see if someone could pull off a bit like what Pakistan did with their the junior PSL tournament. I really think there's an opportunity for someone who's got some money to turn it into like a major scouting event for the IPL teams, and maybe even the PSL teams, major league teams, of having the best junior players in the world all play in a tournament for 1 or 2 months of the year, develop their skills. It would take a lot of the burden off the boards. A little bit like the summer league in basketball, and then you sort of expand that a little bit. I think that would be a really interesting one. I don't know how it works directly, but I'm sure there are a lot of agents and scouts and managers out there that would love more information about these younger players. And at the moment, the under 19 tournament is mostly what we have. And, it's not that it's even a bad tournament. It's just that there's so little of it, and that's all we have. I don't know how much we would ever learn, if we're being honest. Vikas says, any reason why cricket is not introducing the injury substitutes? Australia could have lost the second test. England, the first test in 2019, because Anderson only bowled 4 overs in the match. In the IPL 21-25 final, Tripathi couldn't bat because of an injury. I don't think sports have injury substitutes, or if they do, very few sports have injury substitutes. And there's a reason why sports don't have injury substitutes. It's because injury substitutes is the easiest thing to manipulate, and there's no test match in the world where a fast bowler will go into it without injuries, right? They just have them all the time. Wicket keepers, their fingers, all the time. You could have an injury substitute in every single game of professional sport, certainly a professional cricket, if you wanted to. And the doctors would have to admit, yeah, his finger is broken. Well, of course his finger's been broken. His finger's been broken for 4 months, but he's still wicket keeping with it. So you can't have injury substitutes. What you can have is substitutes. And cricket, for whatever reason, is a sport that hadn't developed in that direction. I think I've done this before, that substitutes in football start to get in vogue is around the 1950s, I think. obviously American sports is all about substitutions, right? I think we'll eventually have substitutes in cricket, and this won't be a problem. But injury substitutes outside of concussion, we have that really there specifically because we don't want players going out on the field and getting regularly concussed. So it is a slightly different thing. But outside of that, I don't think we're ever going to have actual injury substitutes. I don't think we should. I think if you feel that this is correct, I think what you're really saying is, why don't we have substitutes in cricket? Probably because it's going to cost boards more money to have more players available at any one time, if we're being honest. But, I would love to see Vernon Philander is a very bad example of this, but I'd love to see a bowler who is very good in the first 2 innings where he likes bounce, and you take him out of the game, and then you bring on your slidey left arm finger spinner for the rest of the game. I think it would make the quality of cricket higher, but, we're not there yet. Sendip says, would you pick Bairstow as a keeper for the Indian series? What would be your best England 11 for the Indian series? Well, I wouldn't pick Bairstow as my keeper ever. Even when he was a better wicket keeper than he is now, and everyone's allowed to have a form dip, especially after an injury. I just wouldn't pick Bairstow as my wicket keeper. So no. What would be your best 11 for the India series? I don't think there's that many changes. Obviously, Folks comes in. We talked about Moeen before coming in. Will Jackson, Liam Dawson probably, are more interesting. I think the bowlers are, there's someone like Josh Tongue. Does Mark Wood, is he still handy in those situations? It's a really good question. I'm way too far away from thinking about that yet. Manan says, what websites do you tend to use when looking up stats? All the websites, Crick Metric, House Stat, Crick Info, individual board sites sometimes when they have interesting stuff that I need. What else do I look up? Obviously, Crick Sheets we use for some of our advanced stuffs. Andrew Sampson's stat package I use for stuff. Am I missing any? There's a couple of back-end ones that I have access to as well, or that I can ask for questions on. So yeah, there's quite a few. Gary says, any thoughts on the ongoing T20 World Cup regional qualifiers? Japan seem to be emerging pretty well in the EAP, while Italy's ringers haven't quite gotten them over the line in Europe. No, but Italy did play some good cricket, so they certainly, what were they? They went far away from being Ireland in one of those games. I haven't looked at was it the East Asian Pacific Conference? I think that's what it's called. I haven't looked at that one at all yet. I'm aware it's going on, but I've just been too busy. I've looked a little bit more at Europe. It still looks like the major teams are going about, but I think this is the way to do it, right? Going forward, this is how proper sports do their qualifications, and it seems like it's a step in the right direction. I'd love it for Japan to be very good, and the fact that they were good at under 19 level, or good enough at under 19 level at one stage, I think it could really change things for cricket. Ben says, how good could James Pattinson have been? Really good, Ben. Really good. James Pattinson's interesting in that he's probably a similar height to someone like Dale Steyn, maybe around that Jimmy Anderson height. But he's just incredibly strong, and he had real pace, and he had real skill over the ball. And at his absolute best, his best ball is as good as most of the top end elite bowlers' best ball. I do think he didn't quite have the control that he always needed, and perhaps that was just never bowling, enough. But he's a huge loss in the way that I thought you look at someone like Kemar Roach, who when he came through was absolutely young and skillful and could do everything, and then he has the injury and he comes back as a different bowler. I kind of always hoped that was the worst case scenario for James Pattinson, that he would come back. And at a certain point, you look at Ben Hilfenhaus and you look at Ryan Sidebottom. Actually, no, Ben Hilfenhaus is a better one, but you look at Ben Hilfenhaus, you look at Sean Pollock, you look at some of these bowlers out there, and what they are between the age of 20 and 24 is not what they end up being. And I think with Pattinson, we were still hoping he would come back and be what that young bowler was. and he never had the ability. Pat Cummins could have come back. Pat Cummins is a very different bowler now than he was when he was young. But Pat Cummins could have come back and been 85 mile an hour, different kind of bowler than he is right now. But he's still genuinely fast and has these other skill sets. We never got to see that with Pattinson because he never got to develop his game and change things and everything else. So we didn't even know what the final product could be. But you look at that young product, and he was incredible. I used to love watching him bowl. Roger says, who would be your international level of players you're currently or recently obsessed, fascinated with? Preferably spread out across countries. Let's make it an 11. There's no way I would come up with 11, Roger. Danajay, De Silva, and Shanto. Yeah, so those two would definitely be in it. I still love Pat Brown from England, who we just haven't seen enough of, but obviously bowls in that sort of Bob Appleyard, Mustafiz Rahman style that we haven't seen a lot of before. I suppose Benny Howe's going to be in any list that I have there. Rakeem Cornwall is still, a fascination for me. So he's another one. Who have I got in South Africa? Not sure I have anyone in South Africa. Oh, no, Rassie. Always permanently fascinated by Rassie. Glenn Phillips would be in there from New Zealand. Who do we have from India? I suppose Arshdeep would be one that I'm very, very interested in from there. Mohammed Harris might be my Pakistan one at the moment. Although I suppose Afridi is always front and center. There's Ridoy from Bangladesh as well, who I really like. I said I wouldn't go to 11. I'm probably at 15 already now. Women's cricket, Jade Wellington and, oh my God, the other leg spinner, the English leg spinner I'm quite interested in. Annabelle Sutherland is probably another women's player that I'm very, very interested in as well. Yeah, there's heaps. I can't even keep hold of all my different obsessions. Philip says, there have been some questions in the West Indies being split into individual nations. If this was to happen to all the combined cricket boards, how would Wales do? I have a feeling that they would have a better infrastructure to then start developing players, but struggle to think of a current all Welsh 11 complete with other nations like Barbados. Yeah, where would Wales be ranked? They wouldn't be as high up as Barbados or Trinidad or Jamaica. So they would slip back. I mean, Wales aren't going to be as good as Scotland. Is that their best case scenario, that they're a Scotland level team? I think so. Scotland just seems to have a much better... I don't know as much about the Wales system. I know a little bit. Scotland just seems to have a much better player pool and club cricket environment than what Wales does. So yeah, it's optimistic to think they'd be in the top 15 best teams in the world. And if you split up the West Indies and England with Wales, they definitely wouldn't be in the top 15 in the world at that point. I wouldn't have thought. The other interesting one here is Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland. I don't think on their own either of those teams would go particularly well without the other one. So yeah, it wouldn't be particularly good from that point of view. The thing about Wales is there doesn't seem to be any reason for the ECB to develop cricket in Wales. It's not like there's this huge amount of Welsh talent coming through to them. The people in Wales don't seem to be as in love with cricket as they have been at other times. Now, maybe that's because they don't have top level players as they have had before. So unless they are on their own, I'm not sure how their situation changes. So, for instance, part of Scotland's problem was that Scotland was a feeder team for England. Now that Scotland has changed and, become a bit more about Scottish cricket, that seems to have helped them. Perhaps Wales could do that and still have, still do something else. There's always a movement within Wales to have an independent team. You get these emails from Welsh fans, probably get 2 or 3 a year from them going, have you thought about Wales being an independent team? I'm like, yeah, because you emailed me last year. But I think there's always been that movement, but what there hasn't been is enough passion within Wales to make it. I think that Welsh cricket would be more irrelevant in some ways if it ever went down that path. But that doesn't mean that isn't the right path for them. It's the same with the West Indies. If you just watch the West Indies play a bad test and you think they should split up, then I'm not interested in your opinion. Go away. But if you want to make a claim that for individual islands, it could actually benefit them, that they could put more in, that they could, the government could be involved, they could find a way to pay their players more from a local market than over that sort of scattered West Indian market. Everything else, that's a fair argument to make, right? And I think you can make the same with Northern Ireland, Republic Island, all these different teams that are, hybrid teams in cricket. You could actually make those arguments, I think, fairly well. But let's make them from a good faith position. Don't just say West Indies are bad now, they need to be split up. Don't just say Wales hasn't created any players, they need to go out on their own. Let's start to think of how these things could benefit them. And you have to know the entire setup. And I know the Wales one worse than I probably know the other two situations. All right, let us take a break. And then after the break, we will get to the super chats and see if there's anything else in the group. You're listening to Wagon Wheel. I'm Jarrod Kimber. I remain being Jarrod Kimber. And we'll see you after the break.
This video is brought to you by Wicket Cricket Manager.
Picture this, you made a video and now you want the world to see it in their favorite social media platform. You could bowl into the wind by slaving away making edits, or you could let Memento effortlessly cut those epic moments down, making them perfect for your social media followers. It's like having a runner. You play the shot and they do all the hard work. Sync up your podcast and YouTube and they will be the substitute fielder who does all of the work. With Memento, you can craft a long innings down to the best highlights. Make your content, but let Memento cut it.
All right, welcome back. So many comments today. Thank you so much, everyone in the room. But we've got a bunch of super chats in here as well, and a couple other comments that I've picked up. I don't know how to pronounce this one because it's not. Is it Mystic Referee? Mystic Referee. Let's go with Mystic Referee. I think that's what it is. The recent India-West Indies series ended without a player of the series announced. How can that happen? Should the ICC have its own method of announcing MVPs and a better Hall of Fame? I have absolutely no interest in player of the match, player of the series. The way that they do it in cricket is nonsense. It's not very well thought out. It's not done with any intelligence at all. I've never been involved in any of the votings. Situations, but I've certainly had a lot of friends that have. It's a nonsense, Mr. Referee, for being honest. The whole thing just doesn't really make a lot of sense. So from that perspective, I don't care that when someone will say to me, this player's got 28 player of the match awards. Okay, good. That's better than not having 28. So I'm not particularly interested in that. The Hall of Fame thing, I think, is interesting. I don't feel like there is a good system for Hall of Fame at the moment. And I don't know how they do this. There isn't really a unified cricket media. So the ICC would actually have to create like a cricket media system. And then the way that cricket is done, it would be former players as well. But I don't know, 50% former players and 50% cricketers, and players should be allowed to be put up. Because at the moment, I feel like there are players who probably have missed out on Hall of Fames just because no one's really pushing their case. And that's not the way this should ever be. Those players put their bodies and their, on the line for a long period of time. They deserve the chance to at least get their name up. And if people decide that they don't deserve to be in there, well, that's more than okay because they had a chance. Whereas just suddenly going, oh, and remember this guy from the 50s we've forgotten about, he's in the Hall of Fame. And remember this woman from the 80s, she's suddenly in the Hall of Fame. It should be a much better system than that. I think there should be a mass. Everyone before 1980, I think there should be just a mass of everyone who should be in the Hall of Fame. And a public ballot from the ICC if they wanted to. But I think a media ballot, a past player ballot, whatever that would be, where anyone, there's a few hundred voters, everyone gets a split on those sorts of things. And we just go through and we just nail everyone from before 1980. And then we can start to have a look, or the year 2000. And then we can start to have a look at the more modern players and do that, do it in a way, I suppose, that the Americans do it, of waiting 5 to 10 years. If we're going to have it, I don't care if we have it or not, but if we are going to have it, and we do currently have a Hall of Fame, let's, do it properly. Noel says, he says he loves my work. I'm just going to read that out. Thank you. What preparations does India need to do before the World Cup in 2023? And who, according to you, are the favourites? I haven't done any World Cup preparation yet, just because, this has been a massive summer of test matches for me. India, I think India need to experiment with the ability to go to play non-conservative cricket through it as much as possible, like they did before the last World Cup, and then try and do it the same. They can't keep doing the same thing. They can't keep picking defensive bowlers and anchor batters and think that everything's going to work out for them on the night. It hasn't worked out for them. There's probably luck and variance involved in that, but I think that they need to work out if there's I think that India can score in a way that only England could match them if they actually put their foot down and did things properly. And I don't think there's any reason for them not to do that, which would then, if they want to play with defensive bowlers, then that's fine. But on one side of the ball, whether it be batting or bowling, they have to learn to attack better. And I don't see it in their bowling, as it's currently constructed. I do see the ability to do that in their batting. But, I think there's a lot of things that Indian cricket needed to change. And I can't imagine they've changed that much of it between the last World Cup and this World Cup. Saga says, can 120 to 125 kilometer medium paces, domestic international level, turn into 140 kilometer bowler? Is pace a natural thing developed as a teenager, young adult? So pace is largely down to twitch muscle fibers, right? And, elasticity of your body and strength and timing and all these different things. There are different kinds of bodies that bowl fast. You can put on pace. So I think the best example of that would be Chris Wokes or Tim Southey. And I think they both put on between 5 and 7 kilometers. So Wokes was probably 130 to 130. No, Wokes was probably 135-ish. And he probably got on. No, sorry. Wokes was 138 kilometers. He got to about 145-ish. I think Southey was 135 at tops, and he got to about 142 or whatever. You can't go from 120 to 140 unless there was something so wrong with your action before, and you would have to rebuild it from scratch. But I would guess that you can put on. I think a lot of the seam bowling coaches I've talked to have talked about players putting on, 5 to 7 without too much trouble. There'll be freaks around that might put on 10 to 15. 20 is a big, big jump. Anrik Nortje, I think, certainly had a jump of around 10. But again, that was basically stripping his model down and changing him. So at that stage, you're becoming a different bowler. If you're just talking about getting faster as the same kind of bowler, that's very, very 5 to 7 is probably the limit. If you're willing to get very fit, change the way you bowl, change the way you eat, think about things in a completely different way, you maybe could put on slightly more than that. But you have to remember, factor in what you're losing when you do that as well, right? Some of the skills that you have at 120, 125, you may not be able to do anymore if you completely change your action and everything else. But it's not easy, and not many bowlers manage to put on any pace at all, right? Waleed says, Maxwell, the pioneer of baseball. I've said this before. I might have said it on a recent podcast, so I won't go too much into it, Waleed. Victor Trumper's the pioneer of baseball, right? Baseball, though, is a team-based strategy. We have had plenty of attacking players in Test match cricket before. We have had plenty of players who've used their white ball skills in red ball cricket at times before. This is a complete revolution of the thinking around Test cricket. It is not just one player attacking, because we've had plenty of players throughout the entire history of cricket who have. Larry Constantine attacked. Gilbert Jessop, Victor Trumper. Bradman had a strike rate of 65, 70 at times. Who else do we have? Viv Richards would be another one. Dougie Walters, when he wanted to. We've had attacking players before. This is different. And baseball is an entire team-wide strategy. And it is very much based on taking what was working for them as a team in one-day cricket and bring it to red ball cricket. That's very different than Sehwag or Maxwell being naturally aggressive players, right? So there's a lot of differences throughout that. Deepak says, who is the more skillful bowler, Ashwin or Anderson? Ooh, I like this a lot. I would say it's easier to look skillful when you're a spinner than when you're a pace bowler, because there are little things that you do that are really, really just everything moves slower, so you can notice more things. Having said that, Ashwin probably can master more delivery types than Anderson can. How much more skillful is Ashwin than Harath? And then how much more skillful is... I see Anderson maybe not even the most skillful fast bowler of his era because of Muhammad Asif. It's a really good question. I feel like it's Ashwin, but I don't know if I can back that up with anything. A brilliant question. I'm going to be thinking about that for days. Thank you for your super chat. Ekant says, what are things that professional cricketers' jobs do that are the closest to general desk job responsibilities? They sometimes go to meetings, although not many of them. They sometimes have to, fill out. There's a lot of filling out apps and things of diet, training, all those sorts of things that they sometimes have to fill out on their phone. They have to be at the team bus on time. They can't be late to work. Things. I can't think of anything else. I think that's probably the major ones he can't. George says, might be worth it for the Canada Championship to have subs to get spinners on. So this is what I was interested in about the subs. So we've got two questions. So we've got this one from George, and we got this one for Ashab. Substitutes only for injuries. Never going to happen. Doesn't make any sense. Is completely untenable. I played a cricket game yesterday, and I have a blood blister about the size of a large coin on my toe that is actually causing me some issues when I walk. If that pops, I could easily claim that I've got a problem. I've got an infection with my toe. I've got an injury here, and I can't play. Right? I've got a hamstring strain. I've got a sore shoulder. Cricketers have these things all the time. It is impossible to ever be in a situation where you could have injury substitution. You then need a doctor to come in and say, that guy's not that injured, so he can play. And then he goes out there and the whole, his knee falls apart. And then what? Do you sue the doctor? It's just, it doesn't work. But sorry, that was Ashab's question, wasn't it? To go back to George's one, I found this very interesting for a long period of time. That if you did have substitutions in first-class cricket, you would actually up the quality of the play at different times. So let's say you're going into a game and the opposition's best spinner is Will Jacks. All right, so you're playing against Surrey. The opposition's best spinner is Will Jacks, and it turns out that it's a wicket that you just need spin on. Now, Will Jacks is fine. He's taken wickets at test match level, but is obviously not a frontline spinner. Do you want your players who are in that game to go up against Will Jacks and, I don't know, Dean Elgar bowling, his crappy finger spin or whichever other batter happens to be in the game who can roll their arm over? Or do you want them to go up against the best spinners that are available around? I would have thought from first-class development situation, that's a much better way of doing it. Now, it's tricky and it's going to break the brains of a lot of people. And as I've said before, I mean, look at Ashab's comment. I've explained why injury subs can't do it, and he's asked for another explanation of it, right? It's really hard because we are so hardwired to the 11 being the 11. But it's going to change. I don't think there'll be any sport in the world that will allow for that sort of thing going ahead because of the injury side of things. But also just you want the best players out on the field doing their best jobs. And so there are going to be a lot of people who are going to be upset at it, but it will happen. We already see a flexibility with tour games and everything else out there. And now that first-class cricket is no longer as important as it once was, to go back to one of the earlier questions on Patreon, I think it's probably easier now to have done that than ever before. But it's still going to be a hard movement to come through. And it'll be even harder to get it into Test cricket. But I really do think that it is a possible way forward of doing that. What I would say is that if you are developing talent, I think you make a fairly solid argument to anyone that if you pick the biggest problem in cricket is you pick an 11 and the pitch doesn't do exactly what you want. If you pick a 15, chances are you in that 15 are going to have enough options available to you at any one time to exploit the pitch conditions, which means that the best cricketers are going up against the best kinds of players consistently, rather than you picked a couple of spinners because you thought there was going to be turn, and actually the wicket is weirdly, or the ball's swinging more than ever before, and one team's got 4 seamers in it, and one's got 2 seamers in it, and so the game's kind of over from that perspective at that time. Or it's the same with batting, the same with wicket keeping. You could argue that in the first innings of test matches outside of Asia, that you want a wicket keeper who is incredibly tall and athletic to start the game. And you might say that you want a specialist for the spinners at the end of the game when the footmarks come in. All these things are fair. This all improves the quality of the cricket. You can say that you don't like substitutions, and that because cricket's never had them, it doesn't need them or anything else. But if you were saying that the 11 is going to be stronger than the 15, with this, just the brief things I've said now, it doesn't make any sense, right? There is certainly going to be situations when having substitutes improves the quality of the game. All right. RR says, oh, wait, need to click on it. RR says, any chance of England beating Australia in the next Ashes with Bazball? Look, there's so much cricket that's going to happen between now and then. Australia's got this aging seam bowling unit, spin bowling unit in general. We don't know where Cameron Green is going to be. Will Ben Stokes even be able to walk by that point? It's so far out. What I would say is that I don't think there's any, I've seen nothing in this series that suggests that Bazball is a bust, or that Bazball they should go back to any other system. Ray Jake says, have you heard of Shogo Kimura, who used to be a pro baseball player in Japan, who took up cricket recently and made his T20 debut at the age of 43? Is that even possible to transition at that age? I have not heard of Shogo Kimura, and now, Ray Jake, I'm obsessed by him, and I will Google him the minute this finishes. Look, it depends on what kind of an athlete he is. It's probably, if it's going to happen, obviously T20 is going to make more sense. Did they just pick him because it was a fun story? Did they just pick him because people knew who he was? And these things happen in professional sport. We've seen this, happen before. I don't know any of that sort of stuff. I think I've just done an episode about cricket and baseball, and I'm about to do a video about cricket and baseball as well. But I think going from baseball to cricket seems a lot harder to me than going from cricket to baseball. And a lot of that is that, in cricket, you do have to swing at full tosses and play pull shots and those various basic shots. So you have that swing within your game, even if your normal cricket swing is very different than that. Fielding and throwing and all those things all make a lot more sense. Baseballs can throw the ball, but they're not used to fielding it without a glove on, all those sorts of things. But I'm fascinated to go and see what I can find. Right. I do wonder, as we become more professional in sports and athletes become more and more important, whether we would just get people who are great athletes, but they weren't quite the kind of athlete they needed to be for their sport, and whether they can just change over. I'm really fascinated in that going forward. Sega says, are stats used in cricket as in baseball, like shown in the movie Moneyball? Yeah, well, Moneyball's 20 years old now, so cricket's probably caught up to that. It's slightly different just because we don't have the amount of data, and they don't have a cricket pitch to worry about. So it is very different, and they have a much more controlled environment. But yes, there are certainly teams that do this. There are certainly organizations, but there's still the old coach heads and players and everyone else who has their own say. I mean, I think old coaches and players actually have lots of data in their head. It needs to be reframed to them sometimes. Of having talked to some really old grumpy players who were completely against Moneyball and data and everything else, when you actually start to explain it to them in a way that they understand it, they're like, oh, like for instance, you've got this theory on this thing and you've seen this. Can we go and check if it works? And if you can prove them right, they're very, very excited from that point of view. So yeah, I think the Moneyball is different just because cricket is different than baseball, but I certainly think that there is a lot of data and everything going in, but there's still a lot of teams that don't do it. And there are a lot of teams who don't really understand what they're doing with it as well. Last one from Keshuv, who says, how'd Crawley do in white ball? So he's played 3 ODIs. and he's made runs so far, but there's not a lot to go from there. He's actually a pretty good T20 player. My memory is he strikes at around 135, 140 opening the bat, probably 30 average. Not sensational or anything, but those are pretty good numbers. I know I've seen him in one-day cricket and not been as impressed by him in one-day cricket. They should try him. They'll try him if they don't have better players, right? And at the moment, I think they just think they have better players. But I would think he is on their. I think he's in their planning for T20 cricket. I haven't heard them talk about one-day cricket as well. My memory of watching him, I watched him probably playing 2 or 3 ODI or List A innings where he got a bit lost. Now, some of these were just when he was younger, but he just looked like someone who hadn't played as much one-day cricket. And I don't think he has played a lot at all. And I think that has stifled his development. And, we've talked to players, I've talked to players a lot about this T20 cricket and one-day cricket are so different that you think you can go between the two, but sometimes in sometimes in one-day cricket, you actually don't know what gears to use. My memory of watching Zach Crawley was that he was that kind of player. However, if they just free him up at the top, there's no reason why he couldn't average 30 to 35 with a strike rate of 105 to 110 based on the skills that we know he has. T20 cricket, I think they probably want him to go a little bit harder. I'm not sure he has all the shots. There are probably areas you can tuck him up on a little bit more, but it's a very interesting point. Anyway, thank you so much. Oh, God. Thank you so much. A bunch of super chats there. So thank you to everyone who came in with a super chat this time. Remember, Wagon Wheel will be around next week. It'll probably be moved back to a more normal day. We're having to fit it in wherever we can at the moment. But generally, actually, this is the normal day for Wagon Wheel. I actually did one on time for one. But huge shout out to everyone. Again, all the comments that you put up and anywhere you can share it and like and subscribe and all these different things, they all make a huge difference. But we will be back again next time. And the next podcast will be uncovered when I suppose the Ashes will be over, is my guess. Or if not over, there'll be like a day to go and we can still argue about it all. But huge thanks to everyone. And we will certainly see you again early next week. But there's a bunch of stuff coming up on the site. We've got a little bit more Ashes content. We'll be going to the World Cup stuff as well. So please like, subscribe, follow, do all the things that you need to do. We'll see you next week.
A few years ago, I had a panic attack after ESPN Cricinfo made me their global writer. I'd earned that position, but I also felt like a fraud at the time because I didn't really understand how I wrote. I understand that there was a process and gears and different styles and things, but how it all came together felt a little bit random. And so I began to panic like a golfer with a natural swing, worried one day I'd just end up with the yips. And would my career be over? So I took my writing apart piece by piece until I understood it. And then I figured out I could teach others all the mistakes I had learned. So I started an online course where I tried to make it as cheap as possible so people like me would be able to afford it. It's called Fans with Laptops, and heaps of people from around the world have used it so far, from first-time writers all the way through to professionals trying to improve. I started with a simple plan to make each writer the best they could be. And from the feedback I've received over the years, it seems like the course does that. But after COVID, my career changed. I came to YouTube, started podcasts, wrote emails, and formed a new career on my own going forward. So I now had something else to offer, the multimedia side of things, social media and everything else. Not to mention that I was building everything up as an independent. And so I added all of that to my course. So if you have ever wanted to work in sports as a writer or podcaster, making videos or anything else, Fans with Laptops is the place to start. If you think you qualify as a fan and you have a laptop and you want to work in sport, click on the link.